You're nothing but a vindictive witch hiding behind grief, my sister-in-law. Monica screamed across the dining room table while my son Jason sat there nodding like a bobblehead. David's been dead for 8 months, and you're still trying to control us from beyond the grave through his mother. My daughter Bethany slammed her coffee mug so hard it cracked. She's embarrassing us, Mom. The whole church knows what you did to Uncle Kevin's credit. That's when my youngest, 17-year-old Marcus, looked me dead in the eye and said the words that shattered what was left of my world. Dad would be ashamed of who you've become. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 weeks later, my phone erupted with 37 missed calls in 1 hour. The final voicemail was Bethany sobbing. Mom, Marcus is gone. He left a letter saying he can't watch us destroy each other anymore. We need you. Please. But they weren't calling because they missed me. They were calling because their perfect little therapy narrative was about to crumble, and they needed their scapegoat back to hold it all together. My name is Tilly Anderson, and until 8 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was David's wife of 26 years, mother to Jason, Bethany, and Marcus, and the kind of woman who brought casseroles to new neighbors and never missed a PTA meeting. I kept our household running like clockwork, managed David's contracting business finances, and somehow always found room at our dinner table for whoever needed a home-cooked meal. People in our small town of Millfield knew me as the woman who organized charity drives, remembered everyone's birthdays, and could stretch $1 further than anyone had a right to expect. David used to joke that I could balance a checkbook in my sleep and negotiate payment plans that would make seasoned accountants weep with envy. He wasn't wrong. Growing up poor teaches you things about money that prosperity never could. I learned early that every dollar has a job, every payment has a priority, and sometimes the difference between keeping the lights on and sitting in the dark comes down to knowing exactly which company will work with you and which one won't. When David died suddenly of a heart attack last February, I didn't just lose my husband. I lost my identity, my financial partner, and the one person who understood that my relationship with money wasn't about greed or control. It was about survival, about making sure the people I loved never had to feel the gnawing anxiety of not knowing if there would be enough. David got that because he grew up the same way, watching his mother stretch government cheese and powdered milk into meals that somehow felt like love. But our children, Jason, Bethany, and Marcus, they grew up different. They grew up secure. They never knew what it felt like to have the electricity shut off, or to eat peanut butter sandwiches for dinner 3 nights in a row because payday was still 4 days away. David and I made sure of that. We sacrificed, we planned, we budgeted, and we built a life where our kids could focus on being kids, instead of worrying about whether we could afford their school clothes. The irony wasn't lost on me that our success in protecting them from financial anxiety meant they never learned to respect it either. Jason, 28 and freshly divorced, moved back home 6 months before David died with 2 maxed-out credit cards and a child support payment he couldn't afford. Bethany, 25 and perpetually between jobs, had a talent for finding expensive solutions to simple problems, and an even greater talent for convincing others to pay for them. Marcus, our baby at 17, was the only one who seemed to understand that money didn't grow on trees, but even he had inherited enough of his siblings' casual relationship with spending to make me nervous. When David was alive, he served as a buffer between my practical nature and their free spending habits. He'd gently redirect Jason's get-rich-quick schemes, talk Bethany through budgeting her latest venture, and help Marcus understand why we couldn't just buy everything he wanted immediately. David had a way of explaining financial responsibility that never felt like a lecture, never felt like judgment. He made it feel like care, like protection, like love. After he died, that buffer disappeared, and suddenly I was the only one standing between our family's financial security and complete chaos. I was the one saying no to Jason's business loan requests, questioning Bethany's need for a new car when her current one ran fine, and trying to explain to Marcus why we couldn't afford the expensive summer program he wanted to attend. Without David there to translate my concerns into something that felt supportive rather than controlling, Every conversation about money became a battle. The grief counseling idea came from Monica, Jason's ex-wife, who somehow remained deeply embedded in our family dynamics despite the divorce being finalized 2 years ago. Monica had a psychology degree she'd never used professionally but wielded like a weapon in family discussions, always ready with therapeutic terminology to explain why everyone else's behavior was problematic. She'd been pushing the idea of family therapy since David's funeral, insisting that we needed professional help to process our collective trauma and establish healthy boundaries around shared grief. At first I resisted, not because I was opposed to counseling, but because something about Monica's insistence felt performative, like she was trying to direct a play rather than help a family heal. But Jason embraced the idea immediately, and Bethany quickly followed suit. Marcus seemed ambivalent but went along with it because that's what Marcus did. He kept the peace, avoided conflict, and tried to make everyone else happy, even when it cost him his own comfort. The counselor Monica found was Patricia Wyndham, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who specialized in family grief therapy and operated out of a converted Victorian house on the nicer side of town. Her office smelled like lavender and featured enough tissues and comfortable seating to accommodate even the messiest emotional breakdowns. Dr. Wyndham had kind eyes and a gentle voice, and I wanted to trust her. I really did. Our first session was awkward but not unusual for family therapy. Dr. Wyndham asked us to share memories of David, to talk about how his death had affected our daily routines, and to identify the ways grief was showing up in our individual lives. Jason talked about feeling lost without his father's guidance. Bethany cried about missing their Sunday morning phone calls. Marcus spoke quietly about how empty the house felt without Dad's terrible jokes echoing from the garage. When it was my turn, I talked about the practical changes, the way David's death had shifted every responsibility onto my shoulders. I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by decisions I used to make with a partner, struggling with the loneliness of managing everything alone. I thought I was being honest, vulnerable, appropriate for the setting, but somehow, Monica heard something different. During the drive home, she started picking apart my words, suggesting that my focus on practical matters was a way of avoiding emotional processing. "Tilly," she said in that condescending tone she reserved for moments when she felt particularly enlightened, "I think you're using financial control as a grief response. Instead of dealing with your feelings about David, you're trying to control everyone else's spending." Jason, who was driving, nodded along like Monica was delivering profound wisdom instead of amateur psychoanalysis. "Mom, she might have a point. You have been pretty intense about money lately." I sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the familiar streets of our neighborhood, feeling something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't that they were entirely wrong. I probably was more focused on financial security in the wake of David's death, but their interpretation felt like such a fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and why money mattered to me, that I didn't even know how to respond. The sessions continued weekly and a pattern emerged. Dr. Wyndham would guide us through exercises designed to help us communicate our grief. Monica would interpret everything I said through the lens of financial control, and Jason and Bethany would nod along while Marcus sat quietly in the corner looking more uncomfortable each week. I started to feel like the sessions weren't about healing our family, they were about building a case against me. The breaking point came during our 6th session, when Dr. Wyndham asked us to discuss any ongoing family conflicts that might be complicating our grief process. That's when Monica launched into a detailed account of my financial manipulation, complete with examples of times I'd questioned family spending decisions, or suggested more affordable alternatives to their plans. She described the time I'd asked Jason to contribute to groceries while he was living in our house rent-free as leveraging housing security for compliance. She characterized my suggestion that Bethany consider a used car instead of leasing a new one as using financial shame to control major life decisions. She even managed to turn my concern about Marcus working too many hours at his part-time job into evidence that I was projecting financial anxiety onto a minor child. Wyndham listened thoughtfully, asked clarifying questions, and then gently suggested that grief could indeed manifest as increased need for control, especially around areas where we felt competent and secure. She recommended that I consider individual therapy to work through my relationship with money and control while the family continued group sessions to practice healthier communication patterns. I agreed to the individual therapy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Partly because I genuinely wanted to understand if my behavior was problematic, and partly because I hoped it would prove to Monica and the others that I was willing to do the work. But privately, I was beginning to suspect that the problem wasn't my grief response or my relationship with money. The problem was that my family had found a socially acceptable way to dismiss my concerns and override my input by pathologizing it as trauma response. The individual therapy sessions with Dr. Rebecca Chen were different from the family sessions. Dr. Chen was younger than Dr. Wyndham, more direct in her approach, and less inclined to accept surface explanations for complex behavior. During our first session, she asked me to walk her through my financial history, my childhood experiences with money, and my role in managing household finances both before and after David's death. As I talked, something interesting happened. Instead of hearing my concerns about money as controlling or anxious, Dr. Chen heard them as practical and informed. She understood that my vigilance around spending wasn't pathological, it was adaptive. She recognized that my knowledge of payment systems, negotiation strategies, and financial planning wasn't evidence of trauma response, it was evidence of competence developed over decades of necessity. "Tilly," she said during our third session, "it sounds like you're dealing with two separate challenges. One is grief over losing your husband and life partner. The other is frustration with family members who don't share your financial values or understand your expertise in this area. These are related but distinct issues, and treating them as the same thing isn't helping anyone." That conversation was the first time in months that someone had acknowledged my financial competence as an asset rather than a liability. It was the first time someone had suggested that maybe the problem wasn't my need for control but my family's resistance to guidance they desperately needed, but didn't want to hear. Doc Chen helped me understand that grief could indeed make people more sensitive to financial stress, but that didn't mean all financial concerns were manifestations of grief. Sometimes a budget problem was just a budget problem, sometimes a bad spending decision was just a bad spending decision, and sometimes experienced financial management looked like control to people who had never had to develop those skills themselves. Armed with this new perspective, I started paying closer attention to the family dynamics around money, and what I saw disturbed me. Jason wasn't just struggling with normal post-divorce financial adjustment. He was actively making decisions that would create long-term problems, like taking cash advances on credit cards to fund business ventures he hadn't researched, or agreeing to payment plans he couldn't afford in hopes that his income would somehow increase to meet them. Bethany wasn't just occasionally overspending on discretionary items, she was living as if money were infinite, making major purchases without considering their impact on her budget, and then expressing genuine surprise when she couldn't pay her bills. When I tried to discuss these patterns with her, she'd deflect by saying she was still grieving and couldn't handle money stress right now. Even Marcus, my most financially responsible child, was starting to adopt their attitude. He'd begun asking for money for things he'd previously saved up to buy himself, and when I suggested he wait until he could afford them, he'd remind me that Dr. Wyndham said we shouldn't add unnecessary stress during the grieving process. It was like watching my family develop financial amnesia, forgetting everything David and I had taught them about money management, and replacing it with therapeutic language that justified irresponsibility. And every time I tried to address it, Monica would frame my concerns as evidence that I was using money to avoid dealing with my emotions. The situation reached a crisis point when Jason came to me with a proposal that made my blood run cold. He wanted to take out a significant loan against the house David and I had worked 26 years to pay off, using the money to fund a partnership in a friend's lawn care business. He presented this as a sound investment opportunity, but when I asked to see his business plan, his financial projections, or even basic information about his potential partner's experience, he didn't have any of. When I told him I wasn't comfortable putting our family home at risk for an unresearched business venture, he accused me of being unable to support his dreams, because I was too traumatized by David's death to take appropriate risks. When I pointed out that David would have asked the same questions, Jason said, Dad would have trusted him and found a way to make it work. That night, I lay awake thinking about David, about the conversations we'd had when Jason first started talking about entrepreneurship. David had been supportive but cautious, always encouraging Jason to think through the practical aspects of his ideas before jumping in. David had never been the permissive parent Jason was now remembering. He'd been the practical one, the one who taught all our children to research before they invested, to plan before they spent, to understand the difference between calculated risks and reckless gambles. But David wasn't there to remind Jason of those lessons, and somehow I'd become the villain for trying to preserve them. I started to realize that the family therapy wasn't helping us process grief. It was helping them rewrite history, transforming my practical financial guidance into pathological control and David's memory into blanket approval for whatever they wanted to do. The next week, during what would turn out to be our final family therapy session, I tried to explain this perspective to Dr. Wyndham. I talked about feeling like my expertise was being dismissed, my concerns minimized, and my husband's actual values méprisés. I said I felt like the therapy was being used to justify financial decisions that would have worried David as much as they worried me. Monica's response was swift and sharp. Tilly, this is exactly what we've been talking about. You're so unable to process your grief that you're creating conflict around money to avoid dealing with your emotions. You're using David's memory to control us, and it's not healthy for anyone. Dr. Wyndham nodded thoughtfully and suggested that perhaps I needed more individual work before I could participate effectively in family sessions. She recommended a temporary break from group therapy while I focused on developing healthier coping mechanisms for my grief and anxiety. I looked around the room at my children, hoping someone would speak up, would acknowledge that maybe my concerns had merit, that maybe financial responsibility shouldn't be pathologized just because it was inconvenient. But Jason was nodding along with Monica's assessment. Bethany was checking her phone like the conversation didn't concern her, and Marcus was staring at the floor, shoulders hunched, looking like he wanted to disappear. That's when I realized they didn't want me in therapy to heal, they wanted me in therapy to change. They wanted me to become someone who would say yes to Jason's loan proposal, who would stop questioning Bethany's spending, who would interpret Marcus's increasing requests for money as healthy expressions of need, rather than learned behavior. They wanted therapy to fix whatever was broken in me, that made me unable to just go along with their plans. I agreed to take a break from family sessions, but not for the reasons they thought. I needed time to figure out what was really happening in my family, and I needed space to decide how far I was willing to let this go. Because it felt like I had two choices. I could surrender my financial judgment and watch my family make decisions that would hurt them for years to come, or I could maintain my standards and be branded as a traumatized control freak who was too damaged by grief to function appropriately. What none of them knew was that I'd already started taking a third option. While they were in therapy learning to communicate their feelings about money, I was learning to communicate with their credit. While they were processing their relationship with financial stress, I was developing new relationships with collections departments. And while they were working on healthy boundaries around grief, I was working on creative solutions to their mounting debt problem. Because here's what Monica's psychology degree and Dr. Wyndham's family therapy expertise couldn't address. Loving someone sometimes means protecting them from consequences they're not ready to handle, even when they can't see that protection as love. And sometimes the most therapeutic thing you can do, for people who won't listen to reason, is to make sure their mistakes don't destroy them completely. I just never expected them to find out so soon, or to react so badly when they did. What they didn't understand was that I'd been managing other people's financial crises long before David died. It started when I was 12 years old and my mother sat me down at our kitchen table with a stack of bills and a calculator that had 3 broken buttons. She was crying, not the dramatic kind of crying that demands attention, but the quiet, defeated kind that happens when you've run out of options and pride. "Tilly honey," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to call these people and see if we can work something out. They don't get as angry when it's a child calling." That was my introduction to the world of payment plans, hardship deferrals, and the delicate art of negotiating with people who hold your family's basic needs hostage to a payment schedule you can't afford. I discovered I had a talent for it. Maybe it was because I was young and sounded helpless, or maybe it was because I'd learned to speak their language, the careful balance of desperation and determination that makes creditors believe you'll pay eventually if they just give you a little more time. By the time I was 14, I could stretch a 30-day payment into 90 days, turn a disconnection notice into a manageable payment plan, and find loopholes in late fees that even seasoned bill collectors didn't know existed. When I married David at 22, I thought those skills would become obsolete. David had a good job, steady income, and we both believed in living within our means. For the first few years, I used my negotiation abilities only occasionally, usually to help friends or neighbors who found themselves in temporary financial trouble. David would shake his head and marvel at my ability to turn a threatening collections call into a friendly conversation about realistic payment options. But even during our most comfortable years, I kept those skills sharp. Not because I expected to need them, but because I'd learned that financial security was fragile, and the difference between surviving a crisis and being destroyed by it often came down to knowing how to talk to the right people at the right time in the right way. After David's death, when Jason moved back home with his credit card debt and child support obligations, I thought helping him would be straightforward. He was drowning in minimum payments that were barely covering interest, and his credit score was so damaged that he couldn't qualify for debt consolidation loans. But Jason had inherited his father's pride without his father's practical wisdom, and he refused to let me contact his creditors on his behalf. "I'm 28 years old, Mom," he'd said when I offered to help. "I can handle my own financial problem." But he couldn't handle them, and watching him try was like watching someone attempt surgery with garden tools. He'd call customer service lines and immediately get defensive when they couldn't offer him the payment reduction he wanted. He'd hang up on representatives who asked for documentation he didn't have, then complain that credit card companies were impossible to work with. After 3 months of watching Jason's stress levels climb along with his late fees, I made a decision that felt necessary at the time, but would later be characterized as the first sign of my financial control issue. I called his credit card companies myself, not pretending to be him, but explaining that I was his mother and asking if there were any programs available to help him manage his debt load. The conversation with Capital One went better than I'd expected. The representative was sympathetic, and when I explained Jason's situation, his recent divorce, his father's death, and his difficulty managing multiple payment schedules while grieving, she transferred me to a hardship department I didn't even know existed. Within 30 minutes, I'd arranged for Jason's minimum payments to be reduced by 40% for 6 months, with the option to extend if his circumstances didn't improve. When I told Jason what I'd accomplished, his reaction surprised me. Instead of relief, he seemed almost annoyed that I'd succeeded where he'd failed. "You shouldn't have done that without asking me first," he said, even as he admitted the reduced payments would help tremendously. "It makes me look like I can't take care of myself." That was my first hint that Jason's relationship with his financial problems was more complicated than simple inability to manage them. There was something about struggling that felt important to him, something about accepting help that felt like failure. But I dismissed those concerns because the practical result was positive. Jason's stress decreased, his payments became manageable, and he had breathing room to focus on increasing his income instead of just treading water. Bethany's situation was different, but equally frustrating to watch, where Jason's problems stemmed from legitimate financial hardship complicated by poor negotiation skills. Bethany's issues came from a fundamental disconnect between her lifestyle expectations and her earning capacity. She worked part-time at a boutique clothing store, a job she'd taken because she loved fashion and enjoyed the employee discount, but the wages barely covered her car payment, much less rent, utilities, and the social life she felt entitled to maintain. David and I had been subsidizing Bethany's lifestyle for years, not through direct payments, but through the kind of small, constant financial support that parents provide without thinking about it. We'd paid her car insurance, kept her on our family phone plan, and regularly invited her over for dinner so she wouldn't have to buy groceries. When David died, those support systems disappeared, and Bethany suddenly found herself trying to maintain the same standard of living on significantly less money. Her solution was credit cards, which she seemed to view as a temporary bridge until she found a better job or received the life insurance money she assumed was coming. What she didn't understand was that the life insurance policy David had through his construction company was barely enough to cover his final expenses and a few months of basic household costs. There wasn't going to be an inheritance that would solve her financial problem. By the time I realized how much debt Bethany had accumulated, she was already behind on multiple payments and starting to receive those polite but ominous letters that precede serious collection effort. When I tried to discuss the situation with her, she would either minimize the problem or deflect by talking about how hard it was to focus on practical matters while she was still grieving Dad. "I know you're worried, Mom," she'd say, "but Wyndham says it's normal for grief to affect our decision-making abilities. I just need time to figure things out." But time wasn't something Bethany had, not with interest rates compounding daily and late fees adding up faster than her part-time income could address them. That's when I made my second unauthorized financial intervention. I contacted Bethany's credit card companies, not to arrange payment plans this time, but to understand exactly what options might be available if her situation continued to deteriorate. What I learned was both encouraging and alarming. There were hardship programs available, but most of them required proactive communication before accounts became seriously delinquent. Once payments were more than 90 days late, the options became much more limited and much more damaging to credit scores. I also learned that several of the companies would accept third-party payments without requiring formal authorization, as long as the account holder's information was provided accurately. That knowledge sat in the back of my mind like a loaded gun, something I hoped I'd never need to use but couldn't forget about. The breaking point with Bethany came when she called me crying at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, saying her electricity had been shut off and she didn't know what to do. She'd received disconnection notices, but she'd been hoping to pay the bill with her next paycheck, not realizing that utility companies don't wait for convenient payment timing once they've issued final notices. I drove to her apartment with a flashlight and my phone, and while she sat on her couch crying about how overwhelming everything felt, I called the electric company's 24-hour customer service line. The situation was fixable, but it required immediate payment of the past due amount, plus a reconnection fee, totaling more money than Bethany had in her checking account. "I can cover it tonight," I told her, "but we need to talk about a plan to prevent this from happening again." Bethany nodded gratefully, but when I tried to discuss budgeting strategies the next day, she said she wasn't ready to deal with financial planning while she was still processing Dad's death. She promised to be more careful but resisted any systematic approach to managing her money. That's when I realized that helping my adult children with their financial problems wasn't going to be a matter of occasional emergency assistance. They weren't developing the skills they needed to manage money independently, and their grief was becoming an excuse to avoid learning those skills. If I wanted to protect them from serious financial damage, I was going to have to do more than offer advice they wouldn't take or emergency funds they couldn't repay. Marcus's situation was the most heartbreaking because he was still a minor, still living in my house, and still trying to navigate normal teenage financial issues while watching his older siblings spiral into debt. Marcus had always been my most financially responsible child, the one who saved birthday money and comparison shopped before making purchases. But after David died, I noticed changes in his spending patterns that worried me. He started asking for money more frequently, usually for things he would have saved up to buy himself in the past. When I suggested he wait until he could afford something, he'd point out that Jason and Bethany seemed to buy whatever they wanted, so why couldn't he? When I tried to explain that his siblings were adults making their own financial decisions, good or bad, he'd counter that Dr. Wyndham said the family should be supportive of each other's needs during the grieving process. The most concerning change was Marcus's attitude toward his part-time job at a local grocery store. He'd been proud of that job, proud of earning his own money, and contributing to his own expense. But as family therapy sessions continued and financial stress became a regular topic of conversation, Marcus started talking about quitting because the work was interfering with his ability to focus on his emotional healing. I could see Monica's influence in this shift, the way therapeutic language was being used to justify avoiding responsibility. Marcus had absorbed the message that grief was a legitimate reason to avoid stress of any kind, including the normal stress of managing money and maintaining employment. He was 17 years old, and instead of learning skills that would help him become a financially independent adult, he was learning that emotional distress could be used to excuse practical obligation. The situation with Marcus came to a head when he asked me to buy him an expensive gaming system for his birthday, something that would have cost more than 2 months of his part-time wages. When I suggested he save up for it himself, the way he'd saved for previous purchases, he became upset and accused me of not caring about his happiness during a difficult time. Dad would have found a way to get it for me, Marcus said, and those words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they were true, but because they represented such a fundamental misunderstanding of who David had been as a father and a financial role model. David would have helped Marcus create a savings plan, might have offered to match his contributions dollar for dollar, would have celebrated with him when he'd earned enough to make the purchase himself. But David never would have simply bought expensive items for our children without requiring them to participate in the process of earning and planning. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with David's old calculator and a pile of bills that had grown since his death, and I tried to figure out how to honor his memory while protecting our children from financial decisions they weren't equipped to make. I thought about the skills I'd learned as a 12-year-old girl calling creditors on my mother's behalf, and I wondered if those skills might be the key to helping my family without enabling their irresponsible behavior. The idea that eventually became my secret debt management project started as a simple question: what if I could negotiate payment arrangements for my children that they couldn't negotiate for themselves, not because they authorized me to do it, but because I was better at it than they were? What if I could prevent late fees, avoid collection actions, and maintain their credit scores while they worked through their grief and hopefully developed better financial habits? It wasn't about control, despite what Monica would later claim. It was about damage prevention. I couldn't force my children to make better financial decisions, but I could potentially minimize the long-term consequences of the bad decisions they were making. I could buy them time to learn and grow without destroying their credit scores or accumulating debt loads that would cripple them for years. The first step was research, understanding exactly what each of my children owed, and to whom. This required more detective work than I'd anticipated. But grief had made my children careless with mail and paperwork. Bills were left on counters, statements went unopened, and collection notices were stuffed into drawers like they would disappear if ignored long enough. Jason's debt profile was complicated, but manageable. 3 credit cards, all significantly over their limits, plus his car loan and the child support obligation he couldn't modify. The total was scary, but not insurmountable, especially if the high-interest credit card debt could be addressed quickly. His biggest problem wasn't the amount he owed, but the speed at which interest and fees were compounding his balance. Bethany's situation was worse, because she'd been using credit cards to cover basic living expenses, which meant her debt was growing faster than she could possibly pay it down on her current income. She had 4 credit cards all maxed out, plus her car payment, student loans, and back rent she'd been avoiding because her landlord was a family friend who hadn't started formal eviction proceedings yet. Marcus didn't have debt in the traditional sense, but he was starting to develop expensive habits that would lead to debt if they continued. He'd begun asking me to cover things that he'd previously paid for himself, and he'd started talking about getting his own credit card when he turned 18, viewing it as a form of independence rather than a financial responsibility. The more I learned about their actual financial situations, the more convinced I became that conventional advice wasn't going to help them. They needed dramatic intervention, the kind that could only come from someone with extensive experience in debt negotiation and crisis management. They needed someone who could speak the language of customer service representatives, who understood which companies would work with payment plans and which ones wouldn't, who knew how to prevent small problems from becoming catastrophic ones. They needed me, but they also needed to believe they were handling things themselves, so I developed a plan that would allow me to help them without them knowing they were being helped, at least not initially. I would become their secret financial advocate, working behind the scenes to negotiate better terms, prevent late fees, and maintain their credit scores, while they worked through their grief and hopefully developed the motivation to take control of their financial lives. The plan wasn't deceptive in the traditional sense. I wasn't going to forge documents or pretend to be someone I wasn't. I was simply going to use my skills and knowledge to advocate for my children in ways they couldn't advocate for themselves, the same way I'd advocated for my mother when I was 12 years old, and she couldn't handle the stress of dealing with creditors directly. What I didn't anticipate was how much resistance I would encounter, not from the creditors, who were generally cooperative once they understood the family circumstances, but from my own children, who somehow interpreted my expertise as evidence of psychological problems, rather than practical solutions to real financial crises. But by the time I understood their resistance, I was already deep into the process of unwinding their financial problems, and stopping would have meant letting all my work go to waste while they continued to accumulate debt they couldn't handle. So I kept going, kept negotiating, kept preventing disasters, and kept hoping that eventually they would appreciate what I was doing instead of resenting it. I should have known that hope was naive. I should have known that people who are determined to see you as the problem will find a way to make your solutions look like symptoms, but I loved them too much to let them fail, even when letting them fail might have been the therapeutic thing to do. The first call I made was to Jason's most aggressive creditor, a collections agency that had purchased his debt from a department store credit card he'd maxed out during his divorce proceeding. They'd been calling him 3 times a day, leaving increasingly threatening voicemails about legal action and wage garnishment. Jason would listen to these messages with visible anxiety, then delete them without returning the calls, as if ignoring the problem would make it disappear. I spent an hour on the phone with a collections representative named Robert, explaining Jason's circumstances without mentioning that I was calling without his knowledge. I told Robert about my son's recent divorce, his father's death, his current unemployment situation, and his genuine desire to resolve his debt obligations. I provided Jason's account information and asked if there were any settlement options available for someone in his position. Robert's demeanor changed completely once he understood that he was talking to someone who wanted to solve the problem rather than avoid. He explained that the original debt of $1,200 had grown to nearly $3,000 with interest and fees, but the company would accept a settlement of $800 if paid within 30 days. If Jason couldn't manage a lump sum, they would accept payments of $200 over 4 months, with no additional interest or fees as long as the payments arrived on time. I told Robert I would discuss the options with Jason and call back within a week. Then I hung up and stared at the phone, knowing I'd just committed myself to a path I wasn't sure I could sustain. $800 wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't insignificant either, especially multiplied across all of Jason's creditors. But the alternative was watching him get sued, having his wages garnished, and dealing with the stress of legal action while he was already struggling with grief and unemployment. I decided to start small with just this one settlement, and see how it affected Jason's overall stress level. If it helped him focus on finding work instead of dodging phone calls, then the investment would be worthwhile. If he didn't notice the difference, or continued to accumulate new debt, then I'd know my approach wasn't working and I could stop before spending money we couldn't afford. 3 days later, I called Robert back and arranged to pay the $800 settlement from my savings account. He gave me a confirmation number and promised to send written documentation that the debt was resolved in full. He also mentioned that Jason's file would be updated to show satisfied status, which would help his credit score recover more quickly than if the debt had remained in collections. The change in Jason was noticeable within a week. The phone calls stopped, which meant his anxiety decreased dramatically. He started sleeping better, eating regular meals, and actually looking for work instead of just talking about it. He even mentioned to me that he felt like his luck was turning around, that maybe Dad was looking out for him somehow. I smiled and agreed, not mentioning that Dad's influence was working through his mother's bank account and negotiation skill. Encouraged by the success with Jason's collections debt, I decided to tackle Bethany's electric bill crisis before it escalated further. I'd paid her reconnection fee, but she still owed back payments that would eventually result in another disconnection if not addressed. More importantly, her pattern of waiting until services were shut off before dealing with overdue bills was costing her hundreds of dollars in late fees and reconnection charges that could be avoided with better planning. I called the electric company and spoke with a customer service representative named Maria, explaining that I was calling on behalf of my daughter who was struggling to manage her bills following her father's death. Maria was sympathetic and transferred me to their hardship assistance program, where I learned about budget billing options and payment plans that could prevent future service interruption. The representative in the hardship department, Sandra, explained that they could enroll Bethany in a program that would average her electric costs over 12 months, eliminating the seasonal spikes that had been pushing her bills beyond her ability to pay. They could also arrange for automatic payments from her checking account, which would prevent late fees and ensure consistent service. The enrollment required a small deposit, but it would be refunded after 12 months of on-time payment. I provided Bethany's account information and arranged for the budget billing enrollment, paying the required deposit from my own account. Sandra assured me that Bethany would receive notification about the program change and that her future bills would be significantly lower and more predictable. She also mentioned that participation in the budget billing program would be noted in Bethany's account history, which could help if she ever needed hardship assistance in the future. When Bethany's next electric bill arrived at $68 instead of her usual $150, she was confused but relieved. She called the electric company to make sure there hadn't been a mistake, and they explained the budget billing program without mentioning how she'd been enrolled. Bethany assumed she'd signed up for it herself during one of her previous calls and had forgotten due to grief-related memory issues. That assumption bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I didn't like the idea that my help was being attributed to her own actions, but I also recognized that her belief in her own competence was probably healthier than knowing she needed her mother to manage her utility bill. So I said nothing when she proudly told the family about her proactive approach to budgeting, and I felt only slightly guilty when Monica praised her for taking control of her finance. The success with Jason's collections debt and Bethany's electric bill convinced me that my approach was sound, but it also revealed how extensive their financial problems really were. Each successful intervention uncovered 2 more issues that needed attention. Jason's phone was about to be shut off for non-payment, Bethany's car insurance had lapsed, and she was driving illegally rather than admitting she couldn't afford the renewal. Marcus was starting to talk about getting a job at a fast food restaurant because he'd heard they offered immediate hiring, not understanding that leaving his current job for slightly higher wages would mean losing the flexible schedule that allowed him to maintain his grade. I found myself spending hours each week researching payment options, calling customer service departments, and negotiating arrangements that my children could have made for themselves if they'd had the knowledge, patience, and emotional stability to handle the process. It became a part-time job, but one that felt necessary and productive in a way that the family therapy sessions never had. The therapy sessions, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly focused on my financial control issues and their impact on the family's healing process. Dr. Wyndham had started asking pointed questions about my involvement in my children's financial decisions, and Monica had begun documenting examples of what she called my monetary manipulation tactics for discussion in future sessions. During one particularly uncomfortable session, Monica presented a list of times I'd offered unsolicited financial advice or expressed concern about spending decisions. She characterized my suggestion that Jason contribute to household expenses as leveraging housing for compliance, my recommendation that Bethany consider a roommate as using shame to control living situations, and my concern about Marcus working too many hours as projecting anxiety onto healthy teenage independence. Dr. Wyndham listened thoughtfully to Monica's presentation, then asked me how I felt about these characterizations. I tried to explain that my concerns came from practical experience and genuine care for my children's long-term financial stability, but my words sounded defensive even to me. In that therapeutic setting, surrounded by people who were determined to interpret my expertise as pathology, I couldn't find a way to articulate that sometimes love looks like saying no. sometimes care looks like caution, and sometimes protection requires actions that feel controlling to people who don't understand the risks being prevented. The breaking point came when Dr. Wyndham suggested that I might benefit from individual therapy focused specifically on my relationship with money and control. She recommended a colleague who specialized in financial anxiety disorders, framing my concern for my children's debt as a symptom of trauma that was preventing me from supporting their emotional healing. I agreed to the referral partly because I wanted to prove that my behavior wasn't pathological, and partly because I was starting to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe I was too controlling, maybe my financial knowledge was making me overly cautious, maybe my children were right to resist my input, and maybe the therapy would help me understand how to step back and let them learn from their own mistakes. But even as I made the appointment with Dr. Martinez, the financial anxiety specialist, I couldn't stop thinking about the practical consequences of stepping back. Jason's unemployment benefits were about to run out, and he still hadn't found steady work. Bethany's credit cards were approaching their limits again, despite the breathing room provided by the budget billing program. Marcus was talking about quitting his job to focus on emotional healing, not understanding that financial stability was a crucial component of emotional well-being. My first session with Dr. Martinez was different from what I'd expected. Instead of focusing on my need for control, she asked detailed questions about my financial background, my role in managing household expenses before David's death, and my assessment of my children's current financial situations. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding my perspective rather than correcting it. When I described my children's debt levels and spending patterns, Dr. Martinez asked if I thought their financial problems were related to their grief, or if they represented long-standing issues that had been manageable when David and I were both contributing to solutions. That question stopped me cold because it forced me to acknowledge something I'd been avoiding. My children's financial problems hadn't started when David died. They'd been developing for years, masked by our willingness to provide regular assistance, and buffered by David's income and problem-solving abilities. Jason's impulsive spending and poor planning skills had been evident since college, but David had always been able to help him navigate the consequences without them becoming catastrophic. Bethany's disconnect between her lifestyle expectations and her earning capacity had been a source of family tension for years, but David had found ways to provide support that felt like encouragement rather than enabling. Even Marcus's recent attitude changes represented an acceleration of existing tendencies, rather than entirely new behaviors. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my financial vigilance wasn't a trauma response to David's death. It was an appropriate response to increased responsibility in an area where I'd always been competent, combined with realistic concern about problems that had become more serious without David's involvement. She suggested that my family's resistance to my financial input might have more to do with their discomfort with their own financial situations than with my approach to addressing them. That perspective was validating, but it also made me realize how isolated I'd become in my own family. If my expertise was being dismissed as pathology, and my concern was being characterized as control, then I had to decide whether to continue helping in ways they couldn't see, or to step back and let them experience the full consequences of their financial decision. The decision was made for me when Jason came home one evening with news that his unemployment benefits had been denied for an additional extension, and he was going to have to find work immediately or face serious financial consequences. He was panicked, talking about taking any job available regardless of whether it utilized his skills or offered potential for advancement. He mentioned positions at call centers, fast food restaurants, and retail stores, jobs that would provide immediate income but wouldn't help him build a career or increase his earning capacity long term. I suggested that he might benefit from taking a few days to research opportunities in his field, maybe reaching out to former colleagues or contractors who knew his work. But Jason said he didn't have time for strategic job searching because his bills were piling up and his creditors were getting aggressive. He needed money immediately, even if it meant accepting employment that was poorly suited to his skills and experience. That's when I realized that my successful intervention with his collections debt had only addressed one aspect of a much larger problem. Jason was still living in crisis mode, still making decisions based on immediate pressure rather than long-term planning. The breathing room I'd created by settling his debt had been temporary, and now he was facing new financial pressures that would lead to the same cycle of anxiety and poor decision-making. I could continue to intervene crisis by crisis, settling debts and negotiating payment plans as problems arose. Or I could try a more comprehensive approach, one that would address not just the immediate debt issues, but the underlying financial instability that made those crises inevitable. The second option would require more extensive involvement in their financial lives, more secret negotiations, and more risk that they would discover what I was doing and interpret it as the controlling behavior they were already being trained to see. But watching Jason prepare to take a job that would barely cover his expenses while keeping him too busy and exhausted to look for better opportunities, I realized that half measures weren't enough. If I was going to help, I needed to help completely, even if it meant taking actions they wouldn't understand or appreciate. That night I sat down with David's old ledger books and my laptop and I began developing a comprehensive debt management plan for all three of my children. I researched consolidation options, calculated payment scenarios, and identified the creditors most likely to negotiate favorable settlements. I created spreadsheets, tracking due dates, contact information, and a negotiation history. I established a separate checking account to manage the payments without mixing them with my personal finances. Most importantly, I accepted that I was essentially starting a one-woman debt management company with my children as unwilling clients. I would negotiate their debts, manage their payment schedules, and protect their credit scores while they focused on therapy, job searching, and whatever else they felt was more important than financial responsibility. I would do this quietly, efficiently, and without their knowledge, at least until they were stable enough to appreciate the help rather than resent it. The plan was ambitious, expensive, and probably impossible to sustain long-term, but it was also the most loving thing I could think of to do for children who were determined to see my expertise as evidence of psychological problems rather than practical solutions to real financial crises. If they wanted to spend their energy processing feelings instead of managing money, then I would manage their money while they processed their feelings. I just hoped I could resolve their financial problems before they discovered what I was doing and decided that my secret debt management project was proof that I was too mentally unstable to be trusted with family decisions. Because increasingly, it felt like their ability to dismiss my judgment was becoming more important to them than their actual financial well-being, and I wasn't sure which of those priorities would win if they were forced to choose. The morning everything unraveled started like any other Tuesday in October. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee and laptop reviewing the spreadsheet I'd created to track my children's debt negotiations, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Bethany's name, but when I answered, her voice was shaky and strange, like she'd been crying or hadn't slept. "Mom, I need to ask you something and I need you to tell me the truth," she said without any greeting or small talk. My stomach immediately clenched because Bethany had never been the type to demand truth from anyone. She was more likely to avoid uncomfortable conversations than to initiate them. "Of course, honey. What's wrong?" I tried to keep my voice calm, but I was already running through possibilities in my mind. Had one of my creditor contacts mentioned my involvement? Had a payment confirmation been sent to the wrong address? Had someone at the electric company said something about the budget billing enrollment? "Did you pay my Visa bill last month?" The question was direct and accusatory, nothing like Bethany's usual indirect communication style. "Because I got a statement yesterday showing a payment I didn't make, and when I called the credit card company, they said the payment came from a checking account that isn't mine." My heart started racing, but I forced myself to think clearly. I had been making payments on Bethany's credit cards, but I'd been careful to use electronic payments that wouldn't immediately trace back to me. The Visa payment she was asking about had been part of a larger settlement negotiation where I'd arranged to pay off her entire balance in exchange for waiving accumulated interest and fees. It had saved her almost $600 and cleared her highest interest debt completely. "What checking account did they say the payment came from?" I asked, stalling for time while I tried to figure out how she'd discovered the connection. They wouldn't give me specific details, but they said it was an account registered to someone with my last name. "Mom, did you pay my credit card bill without telling me?" Her voice was getting higher, more upset. because if you did, I need to know right now. I could have suggested that maybe David had set up some kind of automatic payment before he died, or that there had been a banking error, or that maybe her father-in-law had decided to help without mentioning it. But something in Bethany's tone told me that she already knew the answer, and lying would only make the situation worse. "Yes," I said quietly. "I paid it off because you were drowning in interest charges, and I was able to negotiate a settlement that saved you money." The silence that followed was longer and more ominous than I'd expected. When Bethany finally spoke, her voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. "How long have you been doing this? How many of my bills have you been paying behind my back?" The questions came rapid fire, like she was reading from a prepared list. "And don't lie to me, because I'm going to call every company I owe money to and find out exactly what's been happening." I closed my eyes and tried to calculate how much damage this discovery was going to cause. If Bethany called all her creditors and asked about third-party payments, she would uncover not just the credit card settlement, but also the budget billing enrollment, the late fee waivers I'd negotiated, and the payment plan adjustments I'd arranged for her car loan. She would discover that virtually every improvement in her financial situation over the past 3 months had been the result of my intervention rather than her own efforts. "Bethany, can we talk about this in person? I can explain everything, but it's complicated, and I'd rather not do this over the phone." "No, we cannot talk about this in person," she snapped. "You can explain it right now, or I can call Jason and Marcus and we can all figure it out together. How many of my bills have you been paying?" The threat to involve Jason and Marcus forced my hand because I knew that if Bethany called them, they would start examining their own financial situations and potentially discover my interventions on their behalf as well. The visa payment was just the beginning of what could become a complete exposure of everything I'd been doing to help them. "I've been helping with several of your accounts," I admitted. "Your credit cards, your electric bill, your car insurance. I've been negotiating payment plans and settlements that you couldn't get on your own, and yes, I've been making payments when necessary to prevent late fees and service interruptions." Another long silence, then Bethany's voice came back even colder than before. "You've been paying my bill, without asking me, without telling me, while sitting in therapy sessions listening to me talk about learning to be independent and manage my own finances." Each sentence was delivered like a separate accusation. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Do you understand what you've done?" I tried to explain that my goal had been to help, not to humiliate her, that I'd been trying to prevent financial disasters while giving her space to grieve and heal, but Bethany wasn't interested in my explanations. "I'm 25 years old, Mom. I'm not a child. If I wanted your help with my bills, I would have asked for it. What you did is not helping. It's controlling and manipulative and exactly what Monica said you would do." The mention of Monica's name sent a chill through me, because it suggested that this conversation wasn't spontaneous. Monica had been predicting that I would find ways to control my children's finances, and now Bethany had discovered evidence that seemed to confirm those predictions. I had walked directly into a trap that Monica had been setting for months. "Bethany, I understand you're upset, but please try to see this from my perspective. You were about to lose your electricity again, your credit cards were maxed out, and you weren't able to negotiate payment plans on your own. I was trying to protect you from consequences that could have affected your credit for years." "I didn't ask you to protect me," she yelled, and I could hear her starting to cry. "I asked you to support me, while I figured things out myself." There's a difference between support and taking over someone's entire financial life without their knowledge. She was right, and I knew she was right, but I also knew that her financial situation had been deteriorating rapidly, and that waiting for her to figure things out herself could have resulted in repossessions, evictions, and damaged credit that would have taken years to repair. I had made a calculated decision to prevent long-term damage by providing short-term intervention, but I hadn't considered how violated she would feel when she discovered what I'd been doing. "Are you going to call Jason and Mark?" I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know how extensive this revelation was going to become. "I already called Jason," Bethany said, and my heart sank. He's checking his accounts right now. Marcus is still at school, but I'm picking him up early so we can all meet at Monica's house and figure out what else you've been hiding from us. The idea of my children meeting at Monica's house to discuss my financial interventions felt like the worst possible scenario. Monica would frame everything I'd done in the most negative possible light, and my children would be primed to see my help as evidence of the controlling behavior she'd been warning them about for months. Any good I'd accomplished would be overshadowed by the methods I'd used to accomplish. Bethany, please don't involve Monica in this. This is a family matter, and it should be handled within our family. Monica is family, Bethany said firmly. She's been more supportive of our healing process than you have, and she deserves to know that her concerns about your behavior were completely justified. That statement hurt more than anything else Bethany had said, because it revealed how completely my role in the family had been redefined. I was no longer seen as a supportive mother trying to help her children through a difficult time. I was now seen as a problematic family member whose behavior needed to be monitored and controlled by people who had the family's best interests at heart. After Bethany hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my laptop screen, which still displayed the spreadsheet tracking my children's debt negotiation. 3 months of careful planning, hours of phone calls, hundreds of dollars in settlements and payments, all about to be reframed as evidence of psychological problems rather than practical solutions to real financial crises. My phone rang again 20 minutes later. This time it was Jason, and his voice was tight with anger. "Mom, what the hell have you been doing with my bills?" he said without any greeting. "I just called my credit cards and they're telling me that someone paid off my collections debt and arranged payment plans for my other account." "Was that you?" I had hoped that Jason's reaction might be different from Bethany's, that he might appreciate the stress relief my interventions had provided, but his tone suggested otherwise. "Yes, I helped negotiate some settlements and payment arrangement. I was trying to prevent your debt from spiraling out of control while you focused on finding work. You were trying to control my finances," Jason corrected me. "Do you realize that I've been telling people how much better I've been managing my money lately? I've been taking credit for improvements that you made behind my back. I look like an idiot." That perspective hadn't occurred to me, but I could understand his embarrassment. Jason had been proud of what he'd perceived as his improving financial situation, and discovering that the improvements were the result of my intervention rather than his own efforts had to be humiliating. "I'm sorry you feel embarrassed, but I want you to remember how stressed you were before your situation improved. You weren't sleeping, you were avoiding phone calls, you couldn't focus on job hunting, because you were so worried about collections action. My interventions gave you breathing room to address your employment situation." "That's not the point, Mom," Jason said, and I could hear Monica's voice in the background, apparently coaching him through the conversation. "The point is that you made decisions about my financial life without my knowledge or consent. That's not helping, that's controlling." The word controlling was becoming a refrain, repeated by each of my children as if they'd been coached to use. I was starting to understand that this conversation wasn't really about my financial interventions. It was about establishing a narrative that would justify their resistance to my input going forward. They weren't just upset about what I'd done, they were building a case for why my judgment couldn't be trusted in the future. "Jason, I understand you're upset, but I want you to think about the practical results of what I did. Your collections debt is resolved, your credit score is improving, and you have manageable payment plans for your remaining balances. Those are positive outcomes, regardless of how they were achieved." "The outcomes don't matter if the methods were wrong," Jason said, and I could tell he was reading from notes or repeating something someone else had said to him. "We're meeting at Monica's house in an hour to discuss this as a family. You should come so we can address this situation properly." The idea of defending my actions in Monica's living room, surrounded by my children who had already decided I was in the wrong, felt like walking into an ambush, but refusing to attend the meeting would only reinforce their perception that I was unwilling to be held accountable for my behavior. "I'll be there," I said, and hung up before Jason could respond. I spent the next hour trying to prepare for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. I printed out copies of all the settlement agreements I'd negotiated, documentation of the late fees I'd prevented, and calculations showing how much money I'd saved each of my children through my intervention. I thought that presenting concrete evidence of the positive financial outcomes might help them understand that my methods, while unconventional, had been effective. I also tried to prepare emotional arguments about my motivations, explanations of how watching them struggle with debt had reminded me of my own childhood financial traumas, and assurances that my goal had always been to help rather than control. But even as I rehearsed these explanations, I knew they wouldn't matter to people who had already decided that my behavior was problematic regardless of my intentions. Monica's house was a testament to the kind of lifestyle my children aspired to, but couldn't afford on their current income. It was decorated with expensive furniture, featured a kitchen with high-end appliances, and showcased the kind of casual luxury that comes from never having to worry about money. I couldn't help but think that Monica's financial security made it easy for her to dismiss practical concerns as psychological problems. When I arrived, my children were already seated around Monica's dining room table with papers spread in front of them. Marcus looked uncomfortable and confused, like he didn't understand why he'd been pulled out of school for this meeting. Bethany looked angry, but also vindicated, like she'd finally found proof of something she'd suspected for a long time. Jason looked embarrassed and defensive, like he was trying to process conflicting feelings about my interventions. Monica was clearly in charge of the meeting, positioned at the head of the table with a legal pad covered in notes. She greeted me with the kind of fake warmth that people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "Tilly, thank you for coming. I know this is a difficult situation, but I think it's important that we address it honestly so the family can move forward in a healthy way." I took the remaining seat at the table and looked at my children, hoping to see some recognition that this confrontation was being orchestrated by someone who had her own agenda. But they were all looking at Monica as if she were a neutral mediator rather than someone who had been building a case against me for months. "I want to start by acknowledging that your intentions were probably good," Monica continued, "but I think we need to discuss how your actions have affected the family's healing process and what we can do to prevent this kind of situation in the future." The phrase "this kind of situation" made it clear that my financial interventions were being characterized as a crisis that needed to be prevented rather than a help that had been beneficial. I was already being positioned as the problem, and the meeting was designed to determine how to manage me rather than to evaluate whether my actions had been helpful. "Before we discuss prevention," I said, "I'd like to review what actually happened and what the results were. I have documentation showing exactly what I negotiated and how much money it saved each of you." I started to reach for the papers I'd brought, but Monica held up her hand to stop me. "Tilly, the financial details aren't really the issue here. The issue is that you made decisions about your adult children's lives without their knowledge or consent. That's a boundary violation, regardless of the financial outcome." I looked at my children, hoping one of them would ask to see the documentation I'd prepared, would want to understand the practical benefits of my interventions before condemning them entirely. But they were all nodding along with Monica's characterization, apparently convinced that the methods I'd used invalidated any positive results I'd achieved. "Can I at least explain why I felt these interventions were necessary?" I asked. "Of course," Monica said, "but I want to remind everyone that explanations aren't the same as justifications. Understanding someone's motivations doesn't mean we have to accept their behavior." That ground rule made it clear that nothing I said would change their perception of what I'd done. They had already decided that my actions were wrong, and my explanations would be heard as attempts to justify problematic behavior rather than evidence that my behavior had been reasonable under the circumstance. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining my children's financial situations as I'd understood them, the consequences I'd been trying to prevent, and the methods I'd used to negotiate better terms with their creditor. I showed them the documentation I'd brought, explained how much money I'd saved them, and detailed the improvements in their credit scores that had resulted from my interventions. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then Monica spoke, and her response made it clear that none of my explanations had mattered. "Tilly, I understand that you were motivated by concern for your children, but what you're describing is a pattern of financial control that prevented them from learning to manage their own responsibility. By solving their problems without their knowledge, you denied them the opportunity to develop independence and resilience. Jason nodded vigorously. Mom, I thought I was getting better at handling my finance. Finding out that you were managing everything behind the scenes makes me feel like I can't trust my own judgment about anything. Bethany added, It's humiliating to realize that every time I felt proud of figuring something out, you had actually already fixed it without telling me. How am I supposed to learn to be independent if you're secretly managing my life? Even Marcus, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, said, It makes me feel like you don't think I'm capable of learning to handle money on my own. Their responses revealed the fundamental disconnect between my perspective and theirs. I had seen their financial problems as emergencies that required immediate intervention to prevent long-term damage. They saw them as learning experiences that I had robbed them of by providing solutions they hadn't asked for. Monica leaned forward and fixed me with the kind of concerned look that therapists use when delivering difficult truth. Tilly, I think this pattern of behavior is connected to the grief issues we've been discussing in therapy. You lost control when David died, and you've been trying to regain control by managing your children's finances. That's understandable, but it's not healthy for you or for them. The suggestion that my financial interventions were symptoms of unresolved grief rather than practical responses to real problems felt like the final insult. My expertise was being pathologized, my effectiveness was being dismissed, and my motivations were being reinterpreted through a therapeutic lens that turned everything I'd accomplished into evidence of psychological dysfunction. What do you want me to do? I asked because it was clear that some kind of action was expected from me. Monica consulted her notes. We think it would be best if you stepped back from any involvement in the family's financial decisions while you work on processing your grief and control issues in individual therapy. We also think you should consider whether family therapy is the right choice for you right now, given your resistance to addressing these patterns. The suggestion that I should remove myself from family therapy felt like exile, a punishment for refusing to accept their characterization of my behavior as problematic. I was being asked to step away from my own family while they continued to work on their healing without the disruption of my presence. I looked at my children one more time, hoping to see some recognition that this was an overreaction, that maybe my methods had been flawed but my intentions and results had been positive. But they were all looking at me with the kind of disappointed concern that people reserve for family members who have proven themselves untrustworthy. If that's what you think is best, I said quietly, and gathered my paper. I'll step back from family therapy until you feel I'm ready to participate appropriately. As I drove home from Monica's house, I realized that my secret debt management project had accomplished exactly what I'd hoped it would. My children's financial situations were significantly improved. Their credit scores were recovering, and they had breathing room to focus on employment and emotional healing without the constant stress of debt collection calls and service interruption. But it had also cost me my place in my own family. I was now seen as someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted, whose help was unwelcome, and whose presence in their healing process was more disruptive than beneficial. I had saved them from financial disaster, but in doing so I had apparently confirmed their worst fears about my need to control their lives. The irony wasn't lost on me, that while they continued to benefit from the financial stability my interventions had provided, they were simultaneously condemning me for providing that stability. They wanted the results of my help without acknowledging that help, and they wanted to maintain their independence while continuing to live with the improvements I had secretly arranged. But what bothered me most was the growing realization that Marcus had been the most uncomfortable person in that room, and that his discomfort hadn't been about my financial interventions. It had been about watching his family turn against his grandmother in a way that felt coordinated and cruel. If I was reading his body language correctly, Marcus might not agree with the family's assessment of my behavior, but he wasn't in a position to defend me without risking his own place in the family dynamic. That possibility terrified me more than anything else, because if Marcus was being pressured to choose between loyalty to me and acceptance by the rest of the family, I knew which choice any 17-year-old would make. And if I lost Marcus's trust along with everyone else's, then my financial interventions would have cost me everything that mattered while providing benefits to people who couldn't even acknowledge that I'd helped them. 2 weeks passed in a silence that felt heavier than grief. No family therapy sessions, no Sunday dinners, no casual phone calls to check in. My children had effectively excommunicated me from their daily lives, while they continued to benefit from the financial stability I'd secretly provided. Jason found a decent job with a small construction company, made possible partly because his credit had improved enough for him to lease a reliable work truck. Bethany enrolled in a certification program for medical billing, confident she could afford the monthly payments now that her debt obligations were manageable. Marcus continued his part-time job without the constant worry about helping with household expenses. None of them acknowledged these improvements as connected to my interventions. In their narrative, they were simply getting their lives back on track through hard work and therapeutic insight. The fact that their newfound stability coincided perfectly with my secret debt management activities was either a remarkable coincidence or something they'd chosen not to examine too closely. I spent those 2 weeks wondering if I'd made the right choice, or if I should have let them struggle with the natural consequences of their financial decisions. Dr. Chen, my individual therapist, helped me understand that both perspectives had merit. My children deserved the opportunity to learn from their mistakes, but they also deserved protection from consequences that could damage their futures permanently. The challenge was finding ways to provide help that felt supportive rather than controlling. During our sessions, Dr. Chen asked me to consider what I'd hoped to accomplish through my secret interventions, and whether those goals could be achieved through more transparent methods. I'd hoped to buy my children time to develop better financial habits, without destroying their credit or accumulating unmanageable debt. I'd wanted to prevent the kind of financial disasters that could take years to recover from, especially while they were already dealing with grief and major life transition. But I'd also hoped that my competence would eventually be recognized and valued by my family, that they would see the positive results of my interventions, and understand that my financial knowledge was an asset rather than a liability. That hope had been naive. My family wasn't interested in my competence, they were interested in their independence, even if that independence was built on a foundation I'd secretly provided. Dr. Chen suggested that my children's resistance to my help might reflect their own insecurities about money management, rather than legitimate concerns about my method. People who feel incompetent in an area often resent advice from those who are more skilled, especially when that advice comes from someone they feel should defer to their autonomy. My children might have been more comfortable struggling with their debts than acknowledging that their mother could solve problems they couldn't handle themselves. That insight was helpful but also depressing, because it suggested that my financial expertise would always be a source of conflict in my family rather than a resource they could benefit from. I was too knowledgeable to pretend ignorance, too effective to be dismissed entirely, but too threatening to their sense of independence to be welcomed openly. The crisis that brought everything to a head started with a phone call from Marcus's school counselor, Mrs. Patterson, on a Thursday afternoon in early November. She called my house instead of Marcus's cell phone, which immediately told me something was seriously wrong. "Miss Anderson, I'm calling because Marcus hasn't been in school for 3 days, and when we tried to contact him, his phone went straight to voicemail. We also tried calling his emergency contacts, but we haven't been able to reach anyone in your family. Is Marcus ill, or is there something else we should be aware of?" My blood went cold. Marcus hadn't mentioned being sick, and if he'd been absent from school for 3 days, someone in the family should have known about it. The fact that his phone was going to voicemail suggested either that he'd turned it off deliberately, or that something had happened to him. "I haven't heard from Marcus since last weekend," I told Mrs. Patterson. "As far as I know, he should have been in school. Let me call his mother and brother to see if they know where he is." But as soon as I said it, I realized that calling Jason and Bethany would require breaking the silence that had existed between us since the confrontation at Monica's house. I hadn't spoken to either of them in 2 weeks, and calling them now would force me to admit that I didn't know what was happening in Marcus's life. After I hung up with Mrs. Patterson, I tried calling Marcus's cell phone myself. It went straight to voicemail, just as she'd said. I left a message asking him to call me immediately, then tried calling Jason. His phone rang several times before going to voicemail, and I wondered if he was deliberately avoiding my call or if he was simply at work and couldn't answer. I tried Bethany next, and she answered on the second ring, but her tone was cold and formal, like she was talking to a stranger rather than her mother. "What do you want, Mom?" she said without any greeting. "Bethany, Marcus's school called me because he's been absent for 3 days, and they can't reach him. Do you know where he is? There was a long pause. Then Bethany's voice came back sounding confused and worried. What do you mean he's been absent? He left for school Monday morning like always. I assumed he'd been going to classes. Have you seen him since Monday? I asked. No, but that's not unusual. He gets home after I'm usually asleep, and he leaves before I wake up. I just assumed everything was normal. The fact that no one in Marcus's household had noticed his absence for 3 days told me something disturbing about how disconnected they'd all become from each other's daily routine. When David was alive, we always knew where our children were and what they were doing, but apparently, the family's focus on individual healing and independence had created a situation where a 17-year-old could disappear for days without anyone noticing. Bethany, I need you to check his room and see if any of his things are missing. I'm going to try calling Jason and Monica to see if they've heard from him. Why would Monica know anything about Marcus? Bethany asked, but her tone suggested she was already starting to worry. Because she's been very involved in family decisions lately, and if Marcus was upset about something, he might have talked to her. I didn't add that Monica's influence over the family's perception of me might have contributed to whatever had driven Marcus away. Jason didn't answer when I called him, so I left a voicemail explaining the situation and asking him to call me back immediately. Then I called Monica's house, dreading the conversation but knowing I needed to exhaust every possibility before involving the police. Monica answered on the first ring, and her tone was immediately defensive when she heard my voice. Tilly, I'm surprised to hear from you. I thought you were stepping back from family involvement while you worked on your issues. Monica, this isn't about therapy or family dynamic. Marcus has been missing from school for 3 days, and no one knows where he is. Have you seen him or heard from him? The change in Monica's voice was immediate and dramatic. All the therapeutic condescension disappeared, replaced by genuine concern. Missing? What do you mean missing? I saw him Sunday when he came to pick up some things. Jason had left here, but he seemed fine. He didn't say anything about having problems. What things did he pick up for Jason? I asked, wondering if Marcus had been running errands that might give us a clue about his current whereabouts. Just some tools Jason had borrowed from his dad's garage. Marcus said Jason was starting a new job and needed them. Monica paused, then added, Tilly, if Marcus is really missing, we need to call the police. 17-year-olds don't just disappear for 3 days without a reason. I agreed, but I also knew that involving the police would require explaining the family's recent conflicts and my estrangement from my children. If Marcus had run away because of stress related to our family situation, then the questions police would ask might expose problems that would reflect badly on all of us. Let me try calling a few more people first. If I can't locate him within the next few hours, I'll file a missing person report. After I hung up with Monica, I sat in my kitchen, trying to think of where Marcus might have gone, and why he might have felt the need to disappear. He wasn't the type of teenager who acted impulsively or ran away from problems. He was methodical, thoughtful, and usually communicated his concerns rather than simply disappear. But he'd also been under significant stress lately, caught between his loyalty to me and his need to maintain relationships with the rest of the family. The confrontation at Monica's house had clearly made him uncomfortable, and he'd been quiet and withdrawn during the few brief conversations we'd had since then. I started to wonder if Marcus had discovered something about the family dynamics that the rest of us hadn't understood, something that had made him feel unsafe or unwelcome in his own home. He was the most observant member of our family, the one who noticed things that others missed, and he might have picked up on undercurrents that even I hadn't recognized. My phone rang while I was thinking, and Jason's name appeared on the caller ID. I answered immediately, hoping he had news about Marcus. Mom, I got your message. What's this about Marcus being missing? Jason's voice was tense and worried, all traces of the anger from our last conversation forgotten. His school called because he hasn't been there for 3 days. No one in your house noticed he was gone, and his phone is going straight to voicemail. Jason, when was the last time you actually talked to him? There was a long pause while Jason apparently tried to remember his last conversation with his younger brother. I don't know, he admitted finally. Maybe last weekend? We don't really talk much anymore. He's been kind of distant since Since everything happened with you. The phrase, everything happened with you, stung, but I pushed past it to focus on finding Marcus. Jason, I need you to check his room thoroughly and see if he packed clothes or took any money. I also need you to think about any friends he might stay with, or places he might go, if he wanted to get away from family stress. Do you think he ran away because of our fight? Jason asked, and for the first time since the confrontation at Monica's house, I heard something like regret in his voice. I think he ran away because he's 17 years old and he's been watching his family tear itself apart for months. But right now, I'm more concerned about finding him than figuring out whose fault it is. Jason promised to search Marcus's room and call back within an hour. I spent that hour making a list of Marcus's friends, his teachers, his coworkers at the grocery store, and anyone else who might have information about his whereabouts. I also tried to think about what I would do if I were a 17-year-old who needed to get away from family conflict. When Jason called back, the news wasn't encouraging. Mom, he definitely packed. His school backpack is here, but his hiking backpack is gone, along with clothes, his sleeping bag, and about $200 he'd been saving for a car. He also left a note. My heart's, what does the note say? Jason's voice was shaky as he read. I can't watch this family destroy itself anymore. I'm going somewhere I can think clearly without people trying to make me choose sides. I'm safe, but I need time away from all of you. Don't look for me, because I won't come back until you figure out how to treat each other like family again. Marcus. The note was heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. Marcus had clearly been paying attention to the family dynamics, and he'd decided that removing himself was the only way to avoid being forced to participate in our conflict. But he was also 17 years old, and disappearing into the wilderness with a backpack and $200 wasn't a sustainable solution to family problems. Jason, we need to call the police now, I said. I don't care how embarrassing this is for any of us. Marcus is a minor, and he's been gone for 3 days. I know, Jason agreed. But Mom, what are we going to tell them when they ask why he left? How do we explain what's been happening in our family? That question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. My financial interventions hadn't just affected my relationship with my adult children, they'd also created a family environment that had become so toxic that my 17-year-old grandson felt he needed to escape into the wilderness to avoid being forced to choose between loyalty to me and acceptance by the rest of the family. We tell them that the family has been under stress since David died, that we've been handling that stress poorly, and that Marcus apparently felt caught in the middle of conflicts he didn't create and couldn't resolve. The police took the missing person report seriously, especially when they learned that Marcus was a minor who had been gone for 3 days without any contact. Officer Rodriguez, who handled the case, asked detailed questions about Marcus's state of mind, any recent family conflicts, and possible destinations where he might have gone. I found myself explaining the family's recent dynamics to a stranger, describing how grief counseling had created divisions instead of healing, how my financial interventions had been discovered and misinterpreted, and how Marcus had apparently been more affected by these conflicts than any of us had realized. Officer Rodriguez listened without judgment, but I could see him taking notes about family dysfunction, therapeutic interventions, and financial conflict. I realized that Marcus's disappearance was going to force all of our private family business into official scrutiny, and that the police investigation would likely reveal details about my debt management activities that I'd never intended to discuss publicly. Miss Anderson, Officer Rodriguez said when I finished explaining the situation, I want you to understand that we take these cases very seriously, but we also recognize that most teenage runaways return home within 72 hours once they realize how difficult it is to survive independently. The note your grandson left suggests that he's not in immediate danger, and that he's hoping his absence will motivate the family to address their conflicts. So you think he'll come back on his own? I asked, hopefully. It's possible, Officer Rodriguez, but we're also going to start searching likely camping areas and contacting other agencies that might have encountered him. In the meantime, I need all family members to be available for follow-up questions, and I need you to call immediately if he makes any contact. After the police left, I sat in my living room trying to process what had happened. Marcus's disappearance had forced my family back together, but only because we were united in our concern for his safety. The underlying conflicts that had driven him away hadn't been resolved. They'd simply been temporarily overshadowed by a more immediate crisis. My phone rang constantly over the next few hours. Jason called with updates from the police. Bethany called to discuss possible places Marcus might have gone. Even Monica called to offer help and to express regret that the family conflicts had apparently contributed to Marcus's decision to run away. But the most important call came at nearly midnight, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, I heard Marcus's voice, and the relief was so overwhelming that I started crying before he even spoke. "Grandma," he said quietly, "I heard you called the police." "Marcus, where are you? Are you safe? Everyone is worried sick about you." "I'm safe," he said. "I'm camping in the state forest about 50 miles north of town. I have food and water, and I know what I'm doing out here. But I heard on the radio that there's a missing person report, and I didn't want you to worry that something bad had happened to me." "Something bad did happen," I said. "You disappeared without telling anyone where you were going." "Marcus, you're 17 years old. You can't just run away to the forest when family problems get difficult." "I didn't run away from family problems," Marcus said, and his voice was steadier than I'd expected. "I removed myself from a situation that was hurting everyone involved, including Grandma. I've been watching this family tear itself apart for months, and I was tired of being used as a weapon in fights that had nothing to do with." That perspective stopped me cold because it suggested that Marcus had a clearer understanding of the family dynamics than any of the adults involved. "What do you mean you were being used as a weapon?" I asked. "Every time someone wanted to prove a point about your behavior, they would point to how it was affecting me. Monica kept talking about how your financial control was damaging my development. Jason and Bethany kept saying you were projecting your anxiety onto me. Even you used my financial responsibility as evidence that your approach to money was right." Marcus was correct, and the realization was painful. I had used his financial competence as proof that my methods worked, just as Monica had used his discomfort as proof that my methods were harmful. We'd all been interpreting Marcus's behavior through the lens of our own arguments, instead of listening to what he actually needed. "I'm sorry," I said. "You're right. We were so focused on our own conflicts that we weren't paying attention to how they were affecting you." "I don't need an apology," Marcus said. "I need the family to figure out how to function without making me choose sides. I need to be able to love you and trust you without that being interpreted as evidence that Jason and Bethany are wrong. And I need Jason and Bethany to be able to work on their own problems without feeling like accepting help from you means they're admitting they're incompetent." The clarity of Marcus's analysis was remarkable, but it also revealed how much stress he'd been under while the adults in his life had been focused on their own emotional processing. "Marcus, what would it take for you to come home?" I asked. "A family meeting where everyone actually listens instead of just waiting for their turn to explain why they're right," Marcus said, "and an agreement that my relationship with you is separate from everyone else's relationship with you. I shouldn't have to defend you or condemn you based on what other people think I should feel." "I can arrange that," I said immediately. "But Marcus, you need to come home tonight. Sleeping in the forest isn't going to solve anything, and it's not safe for you to be out there alone." "I'll come home tomorrow," Marcus said, "but I want the family meeting to happen within a week, and I want Monica to not be involved. This is our family, and we need to figure out how to be a family without her input." That request surprised me because Marcus had always seemed to accept Monica's presence in family decisions, but apparently his time away had given him perspective on how her involvement had complicated rather than improved our family dynamics. "Agreed," I said. "No Monica, just the 4 of us." "5 of us," Marcus corrected. "I want Dad's memory to be part of the conversation. I want us to talk about what he would actually want for this family, instead of what we imagine he would want." The idea of including David's memory in our family meeting felt both appropriate and terrifying. David's actual values and priorities might not align with the ways we'd been using his memory to justify our current behavior. Marcus came home the next morning, looking tired but determined. He hugged me longer than he had in months, then sat down with Jason, Bethany, and me to plan the family meeting he'd demanded as a condition for returning. The meeting took place the following Sunday in my living room, the same room where David and I had planned family budgets and discussed our children's futures for over 20 years. We sat in a circle without a mediator, without therapeutic frameworks, and without the pressure to process our feelings in professionally approved way. Marcus started the conversation by reading a letter he'd written while camping, a letter addressed to his father's memory that outlined what he thought David would want for our family's future. The letter was heartbreaking and wise, written by a 17-year-old who had apparently inherited his grandfather's practical wisdom along with his grandmother's financial competence. "Dad," Marcus read, "I think you would be disappointed in how we've been treating each other since you died. Not because we're grieving, but because we're using grief as an excuse to avoid the kind of honest communication you always encourage. Grandma has been trying to help us in the only way she knows how, but everyone else has been interpreting her help as control because it's easier to be angry at her than to admit we need the help." He looked up at Jason and Bethany before continuing. "Jason, you've been embarrassed that Grandma could solve financial problems you couldn't handle, so you convinced yourself that her help was inappropriate, instead of being grateful that it was available. Bethany, you've been using therapy language to avoid taking responsibility for your own financial decisions, and you've been letting Monica convince you that competence is the same thing as control." Then he looked at me. "And Grandma, you've been so focused on preventing us from making mistakes, that you forgot we might need to make some mistakes in order to learn from them. You helped us, but you also made it impossible for us to feel proud of our own progress." The accuracy of Marcus's observations was stunning, and the fact that he'd developed this level of insight while dealing with normal teenage stress made me realize how much potential he had, and how important it was to protect that potential from the family conflicts that had been consuming all of our energy. Jason was the first to respond, and his voice was shaky when he spoke. "Marcus, you're right about everything. I was embarrassed that Mom could fix my financial problems when I couldn't, and instead of being grateful for her help, I let Monica convince me that I should be angry about her method." "I'm sorry," Bethany nodded, tears in her eyes. "I knew my finances were a mess, but it was easier to blame Mom for interfering than to admit I didn't know how to fix them myself. I should have asked for help instead of resenting her for providing it." Looking at my children, I realized that my financial interventions had been both necessary and problematic. They'd prevented immediate damage, but they'd also prevented learning opportunities that might have been valuable in the long run. The challenge was finding ways to provide guidance and support that felt helpful rather than controlling. "I want to propose something," I said. "Marcus, you mentioned that you want to be able to love and trust me without that being interpreted as taking sides. I think that's possible if we establish some ground rules about how we handle financial decisions going forward." I outlined a plan where I would serve as a financial consultant to my children when they requested help, but I would not intervene in their financial affairs without their explicit permission. They would have the right to reject my advice, without that rejection being interpreted as personal rejection, and I would have the right to express concerns about their financial decisions without those concerns being dismissed as control issues. Marcus would continue to develop his financial skills with my guidance, but his relationship with money would be based on his own values and goals rather than simply copying my approach. Jason and Bethany would work on building their financial competence gradually, with support available when they requested it, but without the pressure to accept help they weren't ready for. Most importantly, we would all commit to direct communication about financial concerns instead of using therapy sessions or third parties to address problems that should be handled within the family. The plan wasn't perfect, and I knew it would require ongoing adjustments as we learned to navigate our new dynamic, but it felt like a foundation we could build on, a way to honor both my financial expertise and my children's need for autonomy. Monica, predictably, was upset when she learned that the family had resolved their conflicts without her input. She called Jason to express concern that the family was avoiding necessary therapeutic work, and she suggested that my influence over Marcus was evidence that I was still manipulating family dynamics, but Jason's response surprised both Monica and me. He told her that the family had decided to handle their problems internally for a while, and that while he appreciated her previous support, he thought it was time for them to develop their own problem-solving skills without external mediation. Bethany made a similar decision, stepping back from the therapeutic framework that had been encouraging her to see my financial knowledge as evidence of psychological problems rather than practical expertise. Marcus returned to school with a new confidence that came from knowing his family valued his insights and his independence. His grades improved, his stress levels decreased, and he started talking about college and career plans that incorporated financial planning skills he wanted to learn from. Most importantly, our family started functioning like a family again. We had Sunday dinners, we talked about daily problems and successes, and we made decisions together instead of separate. We still disagreed about financial priorities sometimes, but those disagreements felt like normal family negotiations rather than fundamental conflicts about control and independence. The debt management project that had caused so much conflict ultimately proved successful in ways I hadn't anticipated. My children's financial situation stabilized, their credit scores improved, and they developed confidence in their ability to handle money responsibly. But more importantly, they learned that asking for help wasn't the same as admitting incompetence, and that expertise could be a gift rather than a threat. 6 months later, when Jason started his own small business and asked me to help him develop a business plan and budget, I knew that our family had found a balance between support and independence that honored both my experience and their autonomy. When Bethany got promoted to a supervisory position and asked for advice about negotiating her salary, I felt proud that she trusted my judgment enough to seek my input. And when Marcus turned 18, and decided to open his first credit card, he asked me to explain the terms and help him understand how to use credit responsibly. That conversation, conducted with mutual respect and clear communication, felt like vindication of everything I'd tried to accomplish through my secret intervention. My grief for David evolved too, from the sharp pain of loss to a gentler sadness mixed with gratitude for the foundation he'd helped me build. I realized that my financial interventions hadn't been about controlling my children's lives, they'd been about protecting the values David and I had worked so hard to instill. He would have been proud of Marcus's wisdom, Jason's growing business sense, and Bethany's increasing confidence in financial decision-making. But most of all, he would have been proud that our family had found a way to support each other without sacrificing individual growth, and that my financial expertise had ultimately become a source of connection rather than conflict. The experience taught me that love sometimes requires patience more than action, that help is only helpful when it's welcomed, and that the most important financial lesson I could teach my children wasn't about budgeting or debt management. It was about the difference between supporting someone's growth and controlling their choices, and about the trust required to let people make their own mistakes while ensuring they know help is available when they're ready to ask for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.